54 countries came out in support of China at the United Nations after 23 nations released a joint statement criticizing China's anti-terrorism campaign in Xinjiang. Why does the West continue to get involved in China's domestic affairs? Also on the show, Liu Xin recently sat down with Babatunde Ahansi, a UNFPA representative in China, to discuss the joint efforts on the productivity of the population and its stable development. I'm Zhong Shi in for Liu Xin today. Welcome to The Point. "54 countries spoke out to defend China at the UN this week, expressing their support of China's de-radicalization and counterterrorism measures. Belarus Ambassador Valentin Rybakov said, "Now safety and security have returned to Xinjiang and fundamental human rights of people of all ethnic groups there are safeguarded. We commend China's remarkable achievements in the field of human rights." And this came in response to 23 countries who criticized China's purported human rights abuses in the far western Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. So what can China do to reassure the West its practices in Xinjiang are a legitimate anti-terrorism tool? Joining me for the discussion here in the Beijing studio, Einar Tangen, a current affairs commentator, and from New York, Victor Gao, Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization. Einar and Victor, welcome to The Point. There seems to be a lot of misunderstanding and misperception about what's going on in Xinjiang, particularly regarding the nature and functions of those vocational training centers. I want to read a bit to the both of you the letter that was delivered on the 29th of October, which said the 23 countries support the concerns of the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, who suggest those from the Uyghur minority are being forcefully sent to camps. Now, China has vigorously denied the claim of human rights violations, but accusations still prevail. Victor, let me start with you. Tell me what you think this is. Is this another example where the West simply doesn't understand or accept how China does things differently?
Well, first of all, I don't think the accusations prevail. They still persist, of course, and there are more member states in that committee supporting China's view and the situation, rather than these 20 or so countries, every one of which is a Western country, which accuse China of human rights violations in Xinjiang involving the Uyghurs. And I think it's very important to let the facts speak for themselves. Xinjiang does not only have Uyghur as an ethnic group. In Xinjiang, there are more than 25 ethnic groups altogether. And the threat of terrorism and extremism is a real threat. And everyone in Xinjiang does not want to have anything to do with terrorism. And it is very important to really educate the people so that they are aware of the forces of terrorism and extremism and separatism, and they need to get united to fight against terrorism. Now, if we look globally, every country or many countries are actually exposed to terrorism, and every country, each country is different. China is different. Xinjiang region of China is different as far as their exposure to terrorism is concerned. Therefore, China needs to do its job to eliminate terrorism and extremism rather than allow these scourges to prey upon innocent people. And I think the Chinese government is doing the right thing to make sure that China as a whole, and Xinjiang in particular as a region, are no longer suffering from the forces of extremism and terrorism. That's what the Chinese people want to have, and this is the most fundamental, important human rights for the Chinese people. Get away from terrorism and extremism. That counts.
China simply had to do something. These are two very different sets of opinions and perceptions. One is saying, Beijing is saying that China is actually protecting human rights of all ethnic groups in Xinjiang, while the West is saying that this is an abuse of human rights here. Einar, tell me how you make of these very two different opinions.
Well, unfortunately, it's one of those matters that is culturally based. In the West, the individual is put above the society, and there's law, everything, attitudes, freedom of speech, all of these things are held very dearly. And they say that, let many go free, so that one innocent man is not incarcerated. But in the East, it's quite different. It's society as a whole that's put above the individual, and this is what you cannot communicate. There's no way each side can understand the other side because they just feel fundamentally different about it. Now, in terms of what's happening there, from China's perspective, they have to do something. And it's not just about de-radicalizing things. It's protecting society. They do not want a repeat of what happened in Shanghai when a Muslim Uyghur extremists ran down a subway line, slashing old men, children, women, you named it, indiscriminately. If that were to happen again, remember, this is a one-party country. It is the responsibility of the government. They can't point fingers at somebody else and say somebody should have done something. They are the ultimately responsible ones, and the people expect them. If you go through China and you ask them what they expect the government to do, especially in regard to Xinjiang, it's to protect society, to lessen poverty there and things like that. So it's not going to be something that's easily settled.
There's a cultural element to it, as Einar pointed out. But what more can China do, Victor, to reassure the West that they are education centers and not so-called internment camps? There's a huge difference between the choice of words here in describing the situation on the ground in Xinjiang.
Yeah, let me make a point. I think China needs to be more transparent. For example, in China, there is a law saying that every family needs to send their kids, boys or girls, to be educated. It's a 9-year minimum mandatory education. Now, if any parents fail in their job of sending their kids for education in elementary school and middle school, for example, it is an offense. It is a crime. And the society at large, and the government in particular, need to bring that family member to justice to make sure that the kids are not left behind without education. Now, in Xinjiang, there are increasing amounts of incidences where families prevent their kids from going to school to be educated. Why? Because they have been misled by the belief, wrongful belief, that if the kids go to school, they need to study Chinese language, and therefore they will lose out on their Uyghur or Muslim identity. This is completely false. And I think in cases like this, the society at large and the government have a duty to educate the family members to make sure that they no longer stand in the way from depriving their kids of the right to education in Chinese schools. And I think there are many similar examples to show that the society at large and the government do have a legitimate point in making sure that radicalization is not on the increase in Xinjiang, and Uyghur people, Kazakh people, all the other people, Mongolians, Chinese, for example, they all know their duties and laws in China and abide by the laws accordingly, rather than contravening such important laws.
Okay, here's a simple fact. There actually hasn't been any terrorist attack in Xinjiang in 3 years' time. Einar, do you think that's proof that these preventative measures, vocational education centers, have actually worked, have been effective?
I think actually we'll see in the long run what the effect of this is. I mean, you don't get this in a very short period of time. But there has been a lot of attention paid to Xinjiang. There's a lot of security. But I think the most telling thing is the number of tourists that have just mushroomed in terms of the numbers going there. And these are Chinese tourists. You know, obviously, if there was an attack going to be made, it would be made against them. There hasn't been. And that shows you that the government is doing what the people expect them to do, which is control the situation.
Okay. 54 countries, led by Belarus, came out in strong defense of China. And part of the statement read, "We take note that terrorism, separatism, and religious extremism has caused enormous damage to people of all ethnic groups in Xinjiang, which has seriously infringed upon human rights, including right to life, health, and development." Do the words of these countries in support of China's stance on the Xinjiang issues count? Are they being heard, Victor?
Well, for these more than 30 countries, many of which are Muslim countries, Islamic countries, and I think for them to take a position in support of China's general policy fighting against terrorism, extremism, and separatism in Xinjiang is much more eloquent than some of the very empty and hollow words given out by some Western countries, because I think the Western countries, they are doing whatever they can inside their own countries to fight against terrorism, but as far as Xinjiang is concerned, they refuse to acknowledge the fact that Xinjiang is under the attack of terrorism and extremism and separatism. They want to mischaracterize the situation in Xinjiang from a fight against terrorism and extremism and separatism into something they call violation of human rights for the Uyghur people. This is completely mischaracterization, and I think China and all the countries in the world, including the Western countries, need to come up with a common dialogue to conclude that China has the right and the Chinese people have the legitimate expectation that the government in China will need to do whatever we can to fight against terrorism, extremism, and separatism. Yeah, people in China do not want to be
Victor, having said all that,
from these three evil forces.
It would help if there was a little more transparency in terms of opening up these camps so that people can understand that this is not just about terrorism and things like that. It's also about poverty and the root causes of terrorism. For instance, if you're a Uyghur kid and you do not learn Han Chinese and you can't read and write, you don't learn
But
science.
China has provided access to foreign reporters and diplomatic staff to Xinjiang, Einar. Why was that not enough to provide a fuller picture of the situation?
Because if they're guided through there, then they're going to always insist that it was a kind of Potemkin village. What I'm saying is not you give them widespread access, but you do it in a way that it's not completely guided. You say pick one of 5 places. The fact is that China has to make sure that it does not create an apartheid situation where you have large numbers of Uyghur young people who are not able to work because they don't have the basic, they have no training. They can't speak the language, or they can't read, write, they don't know science, they don't have a trade. In almost all of the reports that were given or shown to the international press, it was always about trying to teach them the language and basic skills so that they can survive and prosper.
All right, Einar and Victor, I'm afraid that's all the time we have on this. Einar Tangen, our current affairs commentator, and Victor Gao joining us from New York. He's with the Center for China and Globalization. We'll take a quick break, and when we come back, how did the UNFPA help transform China's maternal health and assist with an aging population? Stay with us.